The tray in Elena Marsh's hands shook as the shouting grew louder behind her. She had never been spoken to like this in front of 40 strangers before, and she prayed it would stop before her whole night fell apart. "You heard me," the man said again, louder this time, loud enough for the entire private dining room to hear. "Sit down at that piano and play something, now." Elena turned slowly. The man standing before her was Richard Vance, the owner of half the buildings on this side of the city. The reason this restaurant had shut its doors to the public for the evening. His tie was loose, his glass was empty for the third time, and his eyes had the glassy shine of a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. "Sir, I am a waitress," Elena said carefully, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. "I am not part of the entertainment tonight." A ripple of laughter moved through some of the guests seated nearby, though it was not clear if they were laughing with Vance or simply nervous about what might happen next. The restaurant, called the Amber Room, was known across the city for hosting exclusive events for people who never had to wait for anything in their lives. Elena had worked there for 8 months, ever since her mother's illness had drained every last coin from their small savings account. This job paid well, better than anything else she could find without a diploma she never finished, and she needed every shift to keep the lights on in the apartment she now lived in alone. Vance stepped closer, swirling the ice in his glass. "I heard you went to some fancy music school. My assistant looked into it before the event. Full scholarship, was it? Piano prodigy waiting tables. That is quite a story." Elena's stomach tightened. She had told exactly one person at this restaurant about her past, a fellow server named Grace, during a slow shift months ago when the conversation had drifted somewhere she did not expect. She had trusted Grace not to repeat it, and yet somehow the information had traveled all the way to a billionaire's assistant before tonight's event had even begun. "That was a long time ago," Elena said quietly. "Things changed. My mother got sick, and I had to leave the program to take care of her." "Sad story," Vance said, though his tone carried no sympathy at all. "But I did not come here for sad stories. I came here to be entertained, and I paid this restaurant a small fortune to make sure that happens. So here is what is going to happen next. You are going to sit down, and you are going to play something for my guests. Consider it part of the service tonight." The restaurant manager, a nervous man named Daniel Cole, appeared at Elena's side almost instantly, his face pale under the warm lighting of the dining room. He pulled her a few steps away, lowering his voice to a whisper only she could hear. "Elena, please," Daniel said. "This man's company just signed a 3-year contract with us for corporate events. Do you understand what that means for this restaurant, for all of our jobs? Just play something short, anything. Get through the next 5 minutes and this will all be over." "Daniel, I have not touched a piano in years," Elena whispered back, her voice cracking slightly. "Not since my mother passed. I do not even know if my hands remember how." "Then fake it," Daniel said, his eyes pleading. "Just give him something. Please. I am begging you." Elena looked past Daniel's shoulder toward the grand piano sitting untouched in the far corner of the dining room, its black surface gleaming under the chandeliers. It had been there since she started working at the Amber Room, used only for decoration, occasionally dusted by the cleaning staff who never once heard it played. She had walked past it hundreds of times, always careful never to look at it for too long, because looking at it reminded her of everything she had given up. The guests were watching now, phones lowered, forks resting on plates, waiting to see what the waitress would do. Some looked amused, entertained by the small drama unfolding in front of them, treating it as part of the evening's spectacle. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, sensing that something about this moment was wrong, even if they were not brave enough to say so out loud. "Sir," Elena tried one more time, turning back to Vance. "I really do not think this is appropriate." Vance set his glass down on the nearest table with a sharp click that echoed through the suddenly quiet room. "Appropriate," he repeated, almost amused by the word. "Let me explain something to you. I built a company from nothing. I have sat across tables from presidents and closed deals worth more money than this entire restaurant will make in a decade. When I ask for something, people generally find a way to make it happen. So I am asking you, very politely, one last time, play the piano." The way he said politely made it clear there was nothing polite about it at all. It was an order dressed up in soft words, the kind of order a man gives when he has never once been told no and does not plan on hearing it tonight either. Elena felt Daniel's hand gently press against her back, guiding her toward the piano without another word needing to be said. Around her, the guests began to murmur, some pulling out their phones again, ready to capture whatever happened next. Elena caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the dark window beside the piano, a tired young woman in a black uniform, her hair pulled back tightly, her hands trembling at her sides. She thought about her mother in that moment, the way she used to sit beside Elena on the piano bench when she was a little girl, guiding her small fingers over the keys with endless patience. She thought about the conservatory letter she had received years ago, the one that had promised a future so different from the one she was living now. She thought about the months spent in hospital waiting rooms, the medical bills that arrived faster than she could pay them, the quiet apartment she now returned to every night with no one waiting for her. She thought about how unfair it was that a man who had never once struggled for anything could stand in front of her and demand she hand over a piece of herself simply because he was bored and had the money to make people obey him. But she also thought about Daniel's terrified face, about the servers around her who depended on this job just as much as she did, about the rent that was due in 11 days. She thought about all the reasons she could not afford to say no, even though every part of her wanted to. Elena reached the piano bench and sat down slowly, her hands resting on her lap for a moment, before she finally lifted them to the keys. The dining room had gone almost completely silent now, 40 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting. Vance leaned against a nearby pillar, arms crossed, a small satisfied smile forming on his lips, as if he had already won something important. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery that made Elena's jaw tighten. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips for the first time in years. Her hands remembered the shape of the instrument even if her mind had tried to forget it. She took one slow breath, glanced briefly at the dark window reflecting the room behind her, and began to play. What came out first was simple, careful, deliberately small. A few gentle notes strung together. Nothing that revealed the years of training buried underneath. Nothing that gave away who she truly was. It was the musical equivalent of a whisper, meant to satisfy the demand without offering anything real in return. She hoped it would be enough to end the moment quickly, to let her stand up, return to her tray, and disappear back into the safety of being invisible. But Vance was not satisfied. He tilted his head, unimpressed, and let out a short laugh that cut through the quiet room. "Come on," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You can do better than that. My 8-year-old niece plays better than that, and she has had lessons for exactly 2 months. I was told you were talented. Prove it." A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was appropriate to laugh but following his lead anyway. Elena's fingers froze above the keys for a moment, her face burning with humiliation. She glanced at Daniel, who mouthed the word please from across the room, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. Elena looked back down at the piano. Something inside her, some quiet ember she had been carefully covering for years, began to stir. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and encouraging, telling her that music was never something to be ashamed of, that it was the one place where she never had to hide. She thought about every person in this room who believed her worth could be measured by how well she served their dinner, how quickly she could be commanded to perform, how easily she could be humiliated for their entertainment. And slowly, deliberately, Elena decided she would give them exactly what they asked for. Not the small, careful whisper she had offered before, but something real, something true, something none of them, especially not Richard Vance, was prepared for. Her hands lifted from the keys for a brief second, hovering in the air, and the entire room seemed to lean in closer, sensing that whatever came next would be different from what came before. Elena's fingers came down again, but this time there was no hesitation in them. The first few notes rang out clear and strong, and immediately the room felt different. The guests who had been whispering fell silent almost instantly, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Even the servers standing near the kitchen doors stopped moving, trays balanced carefully in their hands, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. This was not the simple, forgettable tune Elena had played moments before. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to fill every corner of the dining room and press against the chests of everyone listening. The melody rose and fell with a kind of controlled intensity, each note deliberate, each pause meaningful, as if the music itself was telling a story that words could never fully capture. Richard Vance, still leaning against the pillar with his arms crossed, felt his smug expression begin to falter. He had expected a nervous, mediocre performance, something he could laugh off and move past within a minute or two. What he was hearing instead was something entirely different, something that made the hair on his arms stand up despite himself. He straightened slightly, uncrossing his arms, his eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano as if seeing her for the first time. Elena had chosen this piece without fully deciding to. Her hands simply moved, guided by muscle memory and something deeper, something that lived beneath conscious thought. It was a composition she had written years ago, during the long nights she spent sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, back when music was the only language that still made sense to her. She had never played it for anyone. It had remained locked away in a small notebook tucked inside a drawer in her apartment, untouched since the night her mother passed. Now, in front of 40 strangers and one billionaire who had demanded she perform like a trained animal, Elena let it out into the world for the first time. The melody began with a quiet tension, a sense of something waiting to happen, mirroring the uncertainty she had felt walking into that hospital every single day, never knowing what she would find when she arrived. The notes climbed slowly, building layer upon layer, much like the fear that had built inside her chest. With every passing week her mother grew weaker. There was no anger in the music, not exactly, but there was something raw and unguarded, an honesty that most people in that room had probably never encountered in their carefully curated lives. A woman near the front table set down her wine glass without seeming to notice she had done it, her eyes fixed on Elena's hands as they moved across the keys. A man beside her, who had spent the earlier part of the evening loudly discussing a business acquisition, leaned forward with his mouth slightly open, forgetting entirely about the conversation he had been having only minutes before. Daniel Cole stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, his earlier panic replaced by something closer to disbelief. He had asked Elena to play something short, something forgettable, just enough to satisfy an impatient client. He had no idea, not until this very moment, that the quiet waitress who refilled water glasses and cleared dessert plates carried something like this inside her. Elena's shoulders had relaxed now, her earlier tension melting away as the music took over. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying gently with the rhythm she created, completely unaware of the growing silence around her, or perhaps fully aware of it, and simply no longer caring. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not thinking about her tray, her rent, her exhaustion, or the man who had forced her into this seat. She was simply playing, the way she used to when she was a little girl sitting beside her mother, before illness and loss had taken that joy away from her. The piece shifted into its second movement, the notes growing slightly softer, almost tender, like a memory surfacing after being buried for a long time. Elena thought of her mother's hands, once strong and capable, growing thinner and weaker with each passing month. She thought of the last conversation they had shared, her mother's voice barely above a whisper, telling Elena that no matter what happened, she should never let the world convince her that her music did not matter. A tear slipped down Elena's cheek, but she did not stop playing. If anything, the emotion seemed to sharpen her focus, each note landing with even greater precision and depth. Around the room, several guests exchanged glances, silently confirming to one another that what they were witnessing was not ordinary entertainment. This was something far more personal, something that felt almost too intimate to be witnessed by a room full of strangers, and yet none of them could bring themselves to look away. Richard Vance found himself unable to move. The smug satisfaction he had worn like armor only minutes earlier had completely disappeared from his face. In its place was something closer to confusion, as if the situation had spiraled entirely outside his control, and he no longer knew how to command it back. He had spent his entire adult life believing that money could summon anything he desired, that people would always bend to his will if the price was right or the pressure was strong enough. But what was happening in front of him now felt untouchable by any of that. No amount of money could have produced what he was hearing. No demand could have forced this kind of honesty out of anyone. Near the back of the room, an older man in a dark blue jacket leaned toward the woman seated beside him, whispering something urgently. His name was Arthur Bell, a retired professor who had spent nearly 4 decades teaching at one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country, before stepping back from his position 2 years earlier. He had come to the event as a guest of Vance's business partner, expecting nothing more than an evening of polite conversation and mediocre background music. What he was hearing instead made his pulse quicken in a way it had not in years. "That structure," Arthur murmured to the woman beside him, his eyes narrowing with focused attention. "The way she is layering those harmonies, the control in her left hand. This is not someone who picked up piano as a hobby. This is trained, disciplined, advanced work. Whoever taught her knew exactly what they were doing." The woman beside him, unfamiliar with music theory, simply nodded, too captivated by the performance to fully register his words. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Elena with a mixture of fascination and something close to reverence. The way a person looks when they stumble upon something rare and unexpected, in a place they never thought to search. The piece continued to build, the melody growing more complex, weaving together threads of sorrow and quiet strength in a way that felt almost impossible for a single instrument to carry. Elena's fingers moved faster now, her body fully immersed in the performance, each phrase flowing seamlessly into the next as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before, even though, in truth, no one but her mother had ever heard this piece. Somewhere near the middle of the room, A young couple who had been quietly arguing before the performance began sat in complete silence now, their earlier tension forgotten, both of them staring at the piano with matching expressions of astonishment. A businessman who had spent the evening checking his phone every few minutes had finally set the device face down on the table, his full attention captured by something he could not explain even to himself. Elena reached the piece's most demanding section, a passage that required both hands to move independently across different rhythms, a technical challenge that had taken her years to master back when she was still a student. Her hands did not falter. If anything, they moved with even greater confidence, as if the years away from the instrument had somehow deepened rather than dulled her ability, tempered by everything she had lived through since she last performed in front of an audience. Richard Vance took a small step forward, drawn almost involuntarily closer to the piano, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. He studied Elena's face, the tears now falling freely down her cheeks, her eyes still closed, completely lost in the music she was creating. For the first time that evening, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel in front of others. Genuine uncertainty about what he was witnessing, and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that he might have badly misjudged the woman sitting in front of him. The room remained utterly silent, except for the sound of the piano. 40 people bound together in a single shared moment none of them had expected when they walked through the doors of the Amber Room that evening. Whatever this night had been meant to be, a simple corporate dinner, a display of wealth and status, it had transformed into something else entirely, something none of them would soon forget. And Elena, unaware of the growing awe spreading through the room around her, simply continued to play, carrying every person present toward a place they never anticipated they would go. The music shifted again, moving into its final and most powerful section. Elena's hands rose higher on the keyboard, striking notes that rang out bright and clear, cutting through the heavy stillness of the room, like light breaking through storm clouds. This part of the piece had always represented something different to her, something she had written not out of grief, but out of a stubborn refusal to be broken by everything life had taken from her. She remembered writing this section on a night when she had come home from the hospital so exhausted she could barely stand, her mother's condition worsening with each passing day, the bills piling up on the kitchen table faster than she could read them. She had sat down at the small keyboard she kept in the corner of her apartment, the only piece of her old life she had refused to sell, and let her fingers move without thinking, without planning, simply releasing everything that had built up inside her chest. That same raw defiance poured out of her now, filling every corner of the Amber Room. The notes climbed higher, faster, each phrase more urgent than the last, as if she were fighting against something invisible and refusing to lose. Around the room, several guests found themselves leaning forward in their seats, gripped by an intensity they had not expected from what was supposed to be a quiet corporate dinner. Arthur Bell sat completely still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving Elena's fingers. In his 4 decades of teaching at the conservatory, he had heard countless students perform technically impressive pieces, flawless in execution but hollow in feeling. What he was witnessing now was the opposite of that. This was imperfect in the most human way possible, filled with tiny cracks of emotion that no amount of training could fake. And it was exactly those cracks that made the performance impossible to look away from. Beside him, a woman named Grace, the very co-worker Elena had once confided in months earlier, watched from a small serving station near the wall, her hand pressed against her mouth in disbelief. Grace had known Elena studied music once, long ago, but she had never imagined this. She felt a small pang of guilt, wondering if it had been her own careless mention of Elena's past to another staff member that had somehow reached Vance's assistant before tonight. But that guilt quickly gave way to something closer to pride, as she watched her friend command the entire room without saying a single word. Richard Vance remained frozen near the piano, closer now than he had been at any point during the performance. He studied Elena's face carefully, noticing the way her brow furrowed with concentration, the way her lips pressed together during the most difficult passages, the way tears continued to slip silently down her cheeks even as her hands moved with unwavering precision. He thought about his own life, the private tutors he had hired for his children who barely touched the instruments they paid so much money for, the parties he had thrown that were filled with music no one truly listened to, background noise meant only to fill silence rather than break it open the way this performance was doing now. For a brief moment, Vance felt something uncomfortably close to shame. He had walked into this evening believing that his wealth entitled him to command anyone in the room to do whatever he wished, that a waitress's talent, if she even had any, existed for his entertainment and nothing more. He had not considered, not even for a second, that the person he ordered to perform might be carrying a story far larger and more painful than anything he could have imagined from behind his glass of scotch. The piece began building toward its climax, the melody weaving together every theme that had come before it, the quiet grief of the opening, the tender memory of the middle section, and now this fierce, unshakable resolve. Elena's entire body moved with the music now, her shoulders rising and falling, her foot pressing the pedal with practiced precision, every part of her fully surrendered to the moment. She thought of the acceptance letter she had received from the conservatory years ago, the one she had read over and over again in disbelief, unable to believe that a girl from a small apartment with second-hand furniture had earned a full scholarship to study among some of the most talented young musicians in the country. She thought of the day, only 8 months into her first year, when she received the phone call telling her that her mother had collapsed, that the doctors had found something serious, that she needed to come home immediately. She thought of the conversation with her academic advisor, the sympathetic but firm explanation that scholarships required continuous enrollment, that a leave of absence longer than 1 semester would forfeit her place in the program. She thought of the quiet, aching decision she made that same week, choosing her mother over the music, never once regretting it, but never quite able to fully let go of the grief that came with losing both things she loved most within the same year. All of that poured into her hands now, into every note rising from the piano, filling the dining room with something far more powerful than mere entertainment. This was not a performance meant to please an audience. This was a release, years in the making, finally finding its way into the open air after being locked away for far too long. The businessman near the front table, the one who had set his phone face down earlier, found himself blinking back unexpected emotion, thinking of his own late father, a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and never once had the chance to pursue the things he loved. The young couple who had been arguing earlier sat with their hands quietly intertwined now, their earlier tension completely forgotten, replaced by something softer, something they could not quite name. Even the kitchen staff, drawn by the strange silence that had fallen over the usually lively dining room, began gathering quietly near the doorway, peering out to see what could possibly hold an entire room of wealthy guests in such complete stillness. None of them had ever heard Elena play before. Most of them knew her only as the quiet, hard-working server who always arrived early and never complained, no matter how difficult the shift became. The piece reached its final ascent, the notes climbing higher and higher, building toward a resolution that felt inevitable, as if the entire performance had been leading toward this single moment from its very first note. Elena's hands moved with astonishing speed now, her fingers a blur across the keys, and yet every note remained perfectly clear, perfectly controlled, nothing lost in the intensity of the moment. Richard Vance found himself holding his breath, something he could not remember doing in years, not during business negotiations worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Not even during the moments when his own company's future once hung in the balance. He held his breath now, waiting, along with everyone else in the room, for whatever came next. And then, as suddenly as the intensity had built, the melody began to soften, gently descending from its peak, each note slowing, growing quieter, more delicate, until it seemed to hover in the air like the final breath before sleep. Elena's hands slowed their pace, the notes stretching further apart, each one ringing out and fading into silence before the next one began. The room seemed to lean in even closer, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly might disturb whatever fragile thing was happening. The final notes emerged one at a time, soft and deliberate, carrying with them a sense of peace that had not existed anywhere in the piece before this moment. It was as if Elena, after journeying through grief, memory, and fierce resolve, had finally arrived somewhere calm, somewhere she could finally rest. Her hands lifted slightly off the keys between each note, hovering in the quiet, before gently returning to complete the melody. And then, with one final soft chord, the music stopped. Elena's hands remained resting on the keys for a long moment, her head bowed slightly, her breathing heavy from the emotional and physical effort of the performance. The dining room remained utterly silent, no one moving, no one speaking, as if the entire room needed a moment to fully return to reality after being carried somewhere far away. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few seconds. Elena slowly lifted her head, opening her eyes for the first time since she had truly begun playing, and found herself staring out at a room full of faces she barely recognized anymore, transformed from the amused, distracted crowd she had first seen when she sat down. Tears streamed openly down several faces now, no longer hidden or embarrassed. The woman near the front table who had set down her wine glass earlier was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. The businessman who had thought of his father was staring down at his hands, visibly moved. Grace, still standing near the serving station, had both hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes glistening. Richard Vance stood closest to the piano, completely still, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like humility, an emotion his face rarely showed in public. He stared at Elena, as if seeing an entirely different person than the waitress he had ordered to entertain him only minutes before. Elena slowly lowered her hands into her lap, unsure of what to do next, unsure of how to return to the version of herself who existed only moments ago, the invisible server who cleared plates and refilled water glasses without ever being truly seen. She glanced toward Daniel Cole, who stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, his mouth slightly open, clearly at a loss for words. The silence held for one more heartbeat, thick and heavy, before the first sound finally broke through it, a single voice from somewhere near the back of the room. "Bravo," Arthur Bell said quietly, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show in public settings. He rose slowly from his chair, his hands coming together in a single, deliberate clap that echoed through the silent room. "Bravo. That was extraordinary." His applause broke the spell that had held the room frozen, and within seconds the entire dining hall erupted into applause of its own, guests rising from their seats, hands clapping loudly, several people calling out words of praise that blended together into an overwhelming wave of sound. Elena sat at the piano bench, startled by the sudden noise after so many minutes of complete silence, unsure how to respond to an ovation she had never expected, and certainly never asked for. Arthur made his way toward the piano, weaving carefully between tables, still filled with guests who continued clapping as he passed. He stopped a respectful distance from Elena, studying her with the focused curiosity of a man who had spent his entire career searching for exactly this kind of rare, undeniable talent. "Young lady," Arthur said, once the applause had softened enough for his voice to carry, "may I ask your name?" "Elena," she answered quietly, still catching her breath. "Elena Marsh." "Elena," Arthur repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I spent 38 years teaching piano performance at one of the most respected conservatories in this country. I have heard thousands of students play in my lifetime, some extraordinarily gifted, most simply well-trained. What you just performed was neither of those things alone. That was something far rarer. Tell me, who taught you to play like that?" Elena hesitated, suddenly aware that every eye in the room, including Richard Vance's, remained fixed on her, waiting for her answer. She glanced briefly at Daniel Cole, who gave her a small, encouraging nod from across the room, his earlier panic now completely replaced by something closer to awe. "My mother taught me the basics when I was very young," Elena began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "But most of my formal training came later, when I earned a scholarship to study piano performance at a conservatory. I was accepted into a highly competitive program when I was 18. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Arthur's eyebrows rose with interest, and he leaned in slightly, clearly eager to hear more. "Which program, if you do not mind my asking?" Elena named the school, and several of the guests, more familiar with the world of classical music than she had expected from a room full of business executives, exchanged surprised glances. It was widely known as one of the most difficult programs in the country to enter, accepting only a small handful of students each year from thousands of applicants. "That is remarkable," Arthur said, genuine admiration coloring his voice. "I know several instructors from that program personally. Full scholarships there are exceptionally rare, reserved only for the most promising students. So tell me, Elena, if you earned a place in a program that difficult to enter, how does someone with that kind of training end up serving dinner at a private event, rather than performing on a stage somewhere?" The question hung in the air, and Elena felt her chest tighten. She had spent so long avoiding this exact conversation, burying the story so deeply that even thinking about it usually brought a familiar ache she preferred not to face in front of others. But something about the openness of the room now, the way the earlier hostility had completely dissolved into genuine curiosity and respect, made her feel, for the first time in years, that it might be safe to share the truth. "I was 8 months into my first year when my mother became seriously ill," Elena said, her voice quiet but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "The doctors found a condition that required extensive treatment, and there was no one else to care for her. My father passed away when I was young, and it was always just the two of us. I made the decision to leave the program and come home." The room had gone silent again, though this silence felt entirely different from before, filled not with awkward tension but with genuine attentiveness. Several guests who had laughed along with Vance's earlier demands now looked visibly uncomfortable, perhaps recalling their own reactions with a growing sense of regret. "The conservatory required continuous enrollment to maintain scholarship funding," Elena continued. "A leave of absence longer than a single semester meant forfeiting my place entirely. I did not hesitate. My mother needed me, and there was truly no other choice to make. I spent the next several years caring for her, working whatever jobs I could find to cover medical expenses that our insurance did not fully cover. She passed away a little over a year ago. A woman near the front table, the same one who had set down her wine glass earlier during the performance, pressed a hand against her chest, visibly moved by the story unfolding in front of her. Grace, still standing near the serving station, wiped quietly at her eyes, having never known the full weight of what her friend had carried silently for so long. After she passed, I needed steady work to cover the debts that remained, Elena said, her voice growing slightly quieter. I found a position here at the Amber Room. I have not played piano since the night before her funeral, when I sat down and wrote the piece I just performed for all of you. I never intended to play it for anyone. I am not entirely sure why I chose it tonight, except that once I started, I could not seem to stop. Arthur Bell stood silently for a long moment, processing everything Elena had shared, his expression a mixture of admiration and quiet sorrow. That piece, he finally said, the composition itself. Did you write that? Elena nodded. I did. It does not have a title. I never thought it needed one, since I never planned on anyone else hearing it. It needs one now, Arthur said firmly. What you performed tonight was not simply technically accomplished, though it certainly was that. It was one of the most emotionally honest pieces of original composition I have encountered in years, and I include professional recitals in that assessment. You have a gift, Elena, one that clearly did not disappear despite years away from formal training. If anything, it seems to have deepened. Throughout this exchange, Richard Vance had remained silent, standing near the piano with an expression that had grown increasingly uncomfortable as Elena's story unfolded. The confident, commanding posture he carried at the beginning of the evening had completely disappeared, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain, a man visibly grappling with the weight of his own earlier behavior. He thought back to the moment he had first approached Elena, the careless way he had demanded she perform, treating her talent as though it existed solely for his amusement, never once pausing to consider that there might be an entire painful history behind whatever skill she possessed. He thought about his comment, comparing her playing to his 8-year-old niece, the mocking tone he had used, the laughter he had encouraged from the guests around him. He glanced around the room now, noticing the way several of his own guests, people who worked for his company or did business with him regularly, were looking at him with expressions he had never seen directed his way before. Not admiration, not the careful respect people usually offered him in professional settings, but something closer to quiet disappointment. Elena rose slowly from the piano bench, smoothing down her uniform, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt standing in front of so many people who now knew far more about her private grief than she had ever intended to share. She glanced toward Daniel Cole, silently asking whether she could finally return to her duties and escape the weight of so many eyes upon her. But before Daniel could respond, Richard Vance stepped forward, clearing his throat in a way that immediately drew every eye in the room back toward him. The confident businessman who had spent the evening barking orders and expecting instant obedience now stood slightly hunched, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, looking, for the first time that night, genuinely unsure of himself. Elena, he said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. I owe you an apology, a real one, not the kind people offer simply to smooth things over. I treated you tonight the way I treat most things in my life, as something that exists to serve my convenience, without ever stopping to consider the person standing in front of me. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did. I was wrong to demand you perform, and I was especially wrong to mock you when you tried to give me something small rather than something that clearly cost you a great deal to share. The room remained silent, every guest watching the exchange with rapt attention, aware that they were witnessing something rare. A man known throughout the business world for his unwavering confidence, standing humbled in front of a woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign that this apology might be as hollow as his earlier demands had been. But what she found instead was something that looked, at least in this moment, genuinely sincere. Thank you, she said quietly, though her tone remained guarded, unwilling to fully release the hurt his earlier behavior had caused, even in the face of an apology delivered in front of an entire room of witnesses. Vance nodded, understanding that her caution was more than fair given everything that had happened. He glanced toward Arthur Bell, then back toward Elena, something shifting behind his eyes as an idea began to take shape. I would like to make this right, he said slowly, not simply with an apology, but with something that actually matters. Elena felt her chest tighten again, uncertain what a man like Richard Vance might consider an appropriate way to make amends, and equally uncertain whether she wanted anything from him at all after everything he had already put her through that evening. I do not need charity, Elena said firmly, straightening her shoulders despite the exhaustion still lingering in her body from the performance. I have managed on my own for a long time now, and I will continue to manage on my own. I do not want your money, Mr. Vance, if that is what you are about to offer. Vance held up a hand, shaking his head gently. This is not charity, and I would not insult you by offering it as such. What I am proposing is an investment, the same kind of investment I would make in any venture I believed had genuine, exceptional potential. You possess a rare talent that circumstances forced you to abandon through no fault of your own. I would like to fund your return to that conservatory program, in full, along with whatever additional support you might need to complete your training without financial strain interrupting your progress a second time. Arthur Bell, still standing nearby, nodded slowly in agreement. I happen to maintain close relationships with several faculty members at that institution, he added. I would be more than willing to personally advocate for your readmission, Elena, particularly given what I witnessed here tonight. Programs like that value more than just raw technical skill. They value exactly the kind of depth and honesty you brought to that performance. Elena stood quietly for a long moment, processing the sudden shift her evening had taken. Only 20 minutes earlier, she had been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, forced into a performance she never wanted to give. Now she stood at the center of an offer that could change the entire direction of her future, an opportunity she had long ago convinced herself was permanently out of reach. I appreciate the offer, Elena said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate caution. But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Vance. The way you treated me tonight was wrong. And an apology, even a sincere one, does not erase that. If I were to accept anything from you, it would need to come with clear terms, not simply as a gesture to soothe your own conscience in front of your guests. A flicker of surprise crossed Vance's face, quickly replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Very few people spoke to him with this kind of directness, particularly not employees of businesses he held contracts with, and certainly not immediately after he had attempted to make amends in front of an audience. Name your terms, he said simply. Elena took a steadying breath, allowing herself, for the first time that evening, to consider what she actually wanted, rather than simply reacting to what was being demanded or offered to her. If you fund my return to the program, it needs to be done privately, without any public announcement, without your name attached to any story about this evening. I do not want to be known as the waitress a billionaire decided to save. I want to be known, if I am known at all, for my own work and my own accomplishments. Agreed, Vance said without hesitation. Second, Elena continued, gaining confidence with each word. I am not signing any contract that ties me to your company, or requires me to perform at your events in the future. This offer needs to be unconditional. My music does not become a service you can call upon whenever you please. Vance nodded again, a small, almost rueful smile crossing his face, as if he recognized the fairness of the boundary she was setting given everything that had happened earlier that night. Unconditional. You have my word. And third, Elena said, her voice softening slightly. Daniel keeps his position here, along with every other staff member in this room tonight. None of us should face any consequences for how this evening unfolded, regardless of what happens between us going forward. Daniel Cole, still standing near the kitchen entrance, looked visibly moved by Elena's request, having spent the entire evening terrified that his own job might be at risk depending on how the night concluded. Vance glanced toward him briefly, before returning his attention to Elena. Done, Vance said. All 3 conditions. I will have my assistant draw up the necessary paperwork tomorrow morning, and Professor Bell here can help coordinate directly with the conservatory on your readmission. Elena studied his face one final time, searching once more for insincerity, and finding, as best she could tell, none. She extended her hand toward him, and Vance shook it firmly, the gesture marking the closest thing to a genuine agreement between 2 people who had begun the evening as nothing more than a demanding client and an overlooked employee. The following months unfolded in a way Elena could hardly have imagined during the years she spent believing her music had been permanently left behind. True to his word, Vance arranged the funding quietly, without publicity, working through his assistant and legal team to ensure the conservatory readmission carried no strings attached and no public attention directed toward Elena's private life. Arthur Bell personally reached out to the program's admissions committee, advocating passionately on Elena's behalf, sharing details of her original composition and the exceptional circumstances that had interrupted her studies years earlier. Within 6 weeks, Elena received official confirmation of her readmission, along with a full scholarship covering tuition, housing, and living expenses for the remainder of her degree. She gave her notice at the Amber Room with genuine gratitude rather than resentment, thanking Daniel for the support he had shown her during a difficult moment, even if his initial instinct had been born more from fear of losing a client than concern for her well-being. Grace threw her a small farewell gathering with the rest of the staff, the same co-workers who had once known her only as the quiet server who always arrived early, now looking at her with newfound admiration and respect. Returning to the conservatory felt strange at first, walking through hallways she had once believed she would never see again, surrounded by younger students who had continued their studies uninterrupted while she spent years working double shifts and caring for her mother. But the strangeness faded quickly, replaced by a familiar comfort as she settled back into daily practice, lessons, and the rigorous demands of advanced musical training. Elena worked harder than she ever had before, determined not to waste this second chance that circumstances had so unexpectedly granted her. She began composing again regularly, filling notebook after notebook with new pieces, many of them inspired by memories of her mother, others reflecting the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken that night at the Amber Room. She never spoke publicly about the details of that evening, honoring the privacy she had requested from Vance, though a few close friends within the program eventually learned pieces of the story through her own quiet trust. Nearly 8 months after that night, Elena stood backstage at a small recital hall connected to the conservatory, waiting for her turn to perform in an end-of-year showcase featuring the program's most promising students. Her hands trembled slightly, though this time from excitement rather than fear, a feeling entirely different from the anxious dread she had carried the night Vance first demanded she sit down at that piano. She peered through a small gap in the stage curtain, scanning the audience filling the modest auditorium. Her eyes moved across the rows until they landed, somewhat unexpectedly, on a familiar face seated quietly near the back of the room. Richard Vance sat alone, dressed far more simply than she remembered from that extravagant evening months earlier. No entourage, no assistant hovering nearby. Just a man sitting quietly among an audience of parents, students, and music enthusiasts. Elena had not invited him. She was not entirely sure how he had even learned about the recital, though she suspected Arthur Bell, who remained in occasional contact with Vance regarding her progress, might have mentioned it during one of their conversations. She felt a brief flicker of uncertainty, wondering whether his presence carried some hidden expectation, some quiet reminder of the arrangement between them. But watching him now, sitting unassumingly near the back, making no attempt to draw attention to himself or announce his presence to anyone around him, Elena felt something closer to acceptance than resentment. Whatever his motivations had been that night, however flawed his character remained in many respects, he had kept every promise he made to her, quietly and without fanfare, exactly as she had requested. Her name was called, and Elena stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily obscuring the audience from view. She settled onto the piano bench, adjusting the seat slightly, taking a slow breath as she placed her hands on the keys, an instrument entirely different from that grand piano in the corner of a dining room, and yet somehow carrying the same quiet promise it always had. She glanced briefly toward the audience one final time before beginning, unable to see individual faces clearly through the stage lighting, but knowing, somewhere out there, sat a room full of people ready to listen, truly listen, to whatever she chose to share with them. This time there was no coercion, no humiliation, no desperate scramble to satisfy someone else's careless demand. This time, Elena sat at the piano entirely on her own terms, choosing this moment for herself, choosing to share her gift not because anyone forced her to, but because she finally, fully believed it was worth sharing. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play, the opening notes rising clear and confident into the quiet auditorium, carrying with them everything she had lived through to arrive at this exact moment. And somewhere near the back of the room, Richard Vance closed his eyes and listened, no longer the demanding billionaire who once believed the world owed him whatever he wanted, but simply another person in the audience, grateful for the chance to hear something real,